Good afternoon. It's great to be here with you. I'm Hanna Dershowitz. I'm with the Aleph Institute. We're here to talk about the beginning of the system, and first impressions we hear are so important, right? But in terms of some decisions made at the front end of the criminal legal system, what happens then can make all the difference in the outcomes of a case. So we're here to talk about recent and future efforts in New York to make policy reforms to these important front segments of the criminal system. So in the beginning of a criminal case, significant and impactful decisions are made about, for example, appointment of counsel for individuals who can't afford to hire a private one, which is the vast majority of people who get arrested. In addition, the speed with which a case proceeds can inform and often does inform the quality of the investigation and the outcomes as well in the case. And perhaps the most crucial decision of all is whether to confine a person pre-trial, because that affects everything else about a case. Pretrial confinement also interrupts the life of the person and his or her family, causing severe damage to all those people and the case. Now, the way the cash bail system works in many jurisdictions causes unnecessary incarceration of people who simply are not a danger to public safety or a flight risk. That's why Brian Stevenson recently said that our system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And this is not a small problem. Nationally, 62% of people in our jails have not had their cases adjudicated in any way. And many of these people would be out with no questions asked if they could afford the bail. To put some perspective on the scope of all of this, according to the Brennan Center, nearly a third of the working age population has a criminal record. All of the effects of incarceration hit communities of color most hard because of racism and bias that permeate the system, from policing practices through sentencing and beyond. Another insidious aspect of the system, and I'm sorry, I'm just calling out a few issues that we'll treat more deeply once we're talking in the conversation here, but the proliferation of fines and fees, which accrue throughout the system. They start at the beginning of the time of the case that we're talking about now, but in many jurisdictions, they're themselves a driver of incarceration. These fines and fees pile financial instability on already strained families. Wealth, I think many of us in this room will agree, needs to be thoroughly decoupled from the way a person's treated in our system, and many states are taking steps in that direction. New York recently passed a landmark reform of bail in the state, and we'll hear about that in a few minutes. So we want to get right into the conversation. So with these few things just put out there for food for thought, I'd like, with your permission, to dispense with detailed intros of our wonderful panelists and just briefly identify them. You're welcome to read more about them on the website, and I'll then ask each panelist a question or two to get them started and start the conversation, give them each a chance to share, and then we'll open up the conversation to audience questions. Does that sound okay to everybody? Okay, great. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. In the middle, Justine. Justine Olderman is the executive director of Bronx Defenders, the pioneer of the holistic defense model. She's been at the organization almost 20 years in progressively senior leadership roles, ascending to the executive director post last year. Vidal Guzman currently works as a community organizer for Just Leadership USA, leading on local issues such as the Close Rikers campaign. His story of resilience from the experiences of homelessness, incarceration, and more has been widely featured in the press, and I hope you all were able to hear from him this morning when he shared as well. Jason Starr, closest to me, is a policy and strategy consultant who until Friday was assistant counsel to Governor Andrew Cuomo. Now he's eager to bring his insights as an Albany insider to the work of reform. I look forward to hearing from all of these inspiring and impressive speakers. So with that, I'm going to turn to Justine, and then I'm going to sit down and join you guys. Justine, I've long admired your work, having worked for years myself on public defense reforms, including crafting the Texas Fair Defense Act of 2001. Can you describe for us how your model works, and more broadly, why indigent defense is an often unrecognized but nevertheless critically important tool in our toolbox? Why should people care about it?
Great. So thank you so much, Hanna. I'm thrilled to be here. So what is our model, and why should people care about it? So the Bronx Defenders is a public defender office. And let's sort of do this by a show of hands. How many people have seen some sort of depiction of a public defender in the media, TV, right? Okay, raise your hands high. Okay, pretty much everybody. How many people would describe that depiction as like not exactly positive? Okay. Decent number. Okay. So that sort of contextualizes a little bit of how we got our start and what we're trying to do at the Bronx Defenders. So the organization was created by Robin Steinberg about 23 years ago. And when she created it, she didn't know exactly what the model was going to be. She didn't know what public defense needed. More specifically, she didn't know at the time what it was that our clients, their families, and the community we were going to be serving needed. And so we started kind of traditionally in the South Bronx. We're a small public defender office. We served people in the criminal legal system. We started with 8 people. There were lawyers, there were social workers, that was always part of our model, and investigators. And that was essentially it. But after, just a couple of months, sort of getting acclimated to the South Bronx, one of the things that we started to do, and I came soon after the beginning of the organization, a couple years in, what we started to do is something that, for lawyers is not easy, which is that we tried to stop talking and started listening. And we listened to our clients, we listened to their family members, we listened to the communities, we went into churches, we went to tenants associations, we talked to people, in the local family-owned stores and tried to better understand what did they need and how could we help. And some of what we learned surprised us and some didn't. So the things that didn't surprise us, right, that what people were struggling with in the South Bronx were the things that you would expect from a community that had been under-resourced forever, right? Which is that people were struggling with both the personal, individual drivers of criminal system involvement as well as societal. So what do I mean by that? Individual drivers, untreated, mental illness, need for access to better health care, issues around addiction, family violence, et cetera. And then there were also the societal drivers that we know about, over-policing, lack of access to a proper education, and again, health care. And what we were hearing is that people wanted us as their defenders, right? What are defenders supposed to do? We're supposed to represent people in the criminal legal system, but they wanted people to care about why they were there in the first place. They wanted their lawyers to care and the social workers that were working with them to care about those drivers. And so from there, we really began to build out our social work practice along with our legal practice. And we began to catalog what really were those societal issues and begin to stretch ourselves to think about, okay, societal drivers of criminal system involvement, how can we as public defenders make a difference there? But the thing that really struck us the most, that really transformed our organization into the holistic, innovative, pioneering model for public defense that it is today, that was really about things that were happening after our representation was over. We were looking in this very siloed way between the walls of the courthouse. We were defining our own successes in super traditional ways. I, as a lawyer, as a young lawyer, would represent somebody charged with a drug offense. And I'd feel so good about my advocacy, my skills, my effort that I was able to get them to avoid a jail sentence. To this day, some of those early clients of mine are languishing in immigration detention because of the resolution of that case that I negotiated for them. And so our eyes began to be open to this idea that, yes, okay, the criminal legal case mattered a lot. Of course, people wanted their freedom, they wanted their liberty, they didn't want to be convicted. If they were convicted, either through a plea or a guilty plea, they wanted us to help mitigate that harm. But the harm we were only seeing was within these traditional boundaries. And what we weren't realizing and what we soon learned is you can take something like a drug case, a simple misdemeanor possession of, some sort of small amount of drugs, let's say in somebody's home. And that case alone could be resolved in the criminal legal system in a way that we would define as favorable. And the next thing they know, that person is now being put into eviction proceedings. That person is now being put into deportation proceedings. That person is now facing an ACS investigation, the possible loss of custody of their children because of that case. And once we began to realize that the consequences of criminal system involvement were so much bigger than what we were seeing, we realized that if we cared about actually serving our clients, we had to do more than just represent them in the criminal legal system. We had to be able to identify what these consequences are, and we had to be able to go where our clients went. In some ways, I think we used to think about the criminal legal system as like this assembly line of injustice, right? There are like the drivers of system involvement, then there's this criminal system involvement, and then there are consequences of system involvement. And we decided we need to be able to be at every step in that way, mitigating the harm as we went. The truth is that over time we realized it's even more complex than that. That the entry point into the system can be anywhere. Sure, you can have a drug case in the criminal legal system that leads to an eviction, and that eviction can lead to a child welfare case and one's children's being taken away. But you could also start with an eviction, and that eviction can lead to a child welfare case. And having lost your housing, having lost your children, let's say you had successfully fought an addiction. Guess where you're probably going to end up back in? The criminal legal system. And so once we realized that actually it wasn't one system and it wasn't an assembly line of injustice, it was like a web. It's like a complex web of oppression. And that the entry point can be anywhere, and once you are in it, it is staggeringly hard to get out. You heard reference to that earlier this morning, even in terms of the confines of the criminal legal system with probation and parole, right? But extend that into all these other systems. The network of information sharing is staggering, and it is instantaneous. It's like those movies you see where it's like there's like all these video screens, and like somebody like puts one button on it and like a red light flicks up and all of a sudden these lines come out everywhere. That's what this system is like. They are all these agencies and systems are talking to each other. And if we actually want to address the harms, we have to be able to go where our clients go. So today, what our model looks like is it looks like from those 8 people doing criminal legal work, we now have 400 people. We have lawyers who practice in criminal court, immigration court, family court, and represent our clients in a whole host of civil proceedings. It looks like a robust social work practice that works with our clients to mitigate the harm of their system involvement and address the drivers of system involvement. It also means that we have non-lawyer advocates who are working with our clients in various different spaces. And even in addition to that, it means that it's not enough for us just to represent people in these systems. You're going to hear more from Vidal and Jason about this, but one of the things that public defense can and should be, not just for us, but for everywhere, is to be actively involved, not just in righting the wrongs in an individual case, but taking our proximity. We are inside the belly of the beast, as it were. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the fight with our clients for justice. We are proximate to the people, we are proximate to the problems, and we can help create the solution. And it works. It works writ large, and I'm going to let the others on the panel talk about some of the reforms in New York, and we have been proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in that fight for reforms that will systemically reform our system. But it also works in this interesting way on an individual scale. So recently, the Rand Corporation and the University of Pennsylvania partnered together to study our model. And what they found is that being represented by a holistic defender, which is the name for this sort of wraparound model, it actually reduced pretrial detention by 9%. We reduced incarceration rates by 16%. And we reduced incarceration length by 24%. This is a 10-year study. And writ large, what that meant is that we saved our clients 1.1 million days behind bars. So when you say, why does it matter? Right? It matters for a host of different reasons. Public defense matters because what we are trying to do is the thing the system does not want us to do. The system does not want to hear or see our clients. The system, and I mean all this big monolithic, right, this huge labyrinthian system, this system only works when it successfully denies our clients and people who go through the system their humanity and their dignity. And as defenders, our job is to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and inject something into the system it does not want. It is to force them to see and hear our clients. And when we do that, we actually produce those results that the RAND study found. And when we do that, we can be partners with our allies in government and grassroots organizations to help create long-lasting change. And one of the things that I will point out, and I'm so thrilled to be on this breakout panel, but even here, think about all of the plenary panels. There's been no public defender voice in the plenary panels. All these people that are making a huge difference in the reform space. But generally, public defenders are not at the table. And that's what I'm hoping that you take away from this panel, is to say, when you go into spaces where you are talking about criminal justice reform, whether it's in New York and other places, say, where are the public defenders? Let's bring them into the conversation. Let's bring them to the table, because we are part of the solution as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's always wonderful when practitioners can also bring themselves to the spaces of reform and bring that deep practice into the policy arena. So that's very much appreciated. Vidal, New York recently enacted a momentous bail reform package, yet Rikers is not closed. And maybe there are other problems still left. What's the significance and impact of the changes to pretrial processes, and what's left in the closed Rikers journey? What can people in this room and outside of these walls do to move reform further here and in other states?
I heard 4 things.
Sorry.
I think the first thing is New York had a system that we hear many stories of people being pretrialed and still awaiting trial for 6, 7, 8 years. Even we heard of someone even awaiting trial 10 years. We have someone who was a mother who was a part of the campaign, and her son was awaiting trial 6 years until he couldn't take it no more, and basically, as we call it, copped out and just took whatever to come home. So we had a system that prosecutors could withhold evidence and until that person decided to go to trial. And the scariest thing for someone who's black and brown is trial. Like, when people think about how life flashes by you, talk to someone who's black and brown, living in an underfunded, over-incarcerated, over-police community about facing trial. And even knowing that they're innocent, or even knowing that, you know what I'm saying, there's not enough evidence, or even knowing that they're still innocent to proving guilty, and what does that actually mean? So our pretrial system that was in place, one of the things we had to figure out was, how do we close Rikers? It wasn't just about saying just close Rikers. What policy has to be in place to make some process actually happen? We knew that we had a readiness bill, knowing that prosecutors can stop the clock at any moment and say, well, we're trial ready, and 3 months later down the line, and tell the judge, hey man, I'm not trial ready, or hey man, I can't do today, I got a dentist appointment. Simple stuff like that, and the clock would stop. And a person who took it all day, woke up probably 5 o'clock in the morning, and to be seen for probably 5 minutes to be put back in the cell and go back to Rikers Island, 8 hour or 7 hour time frame for someone who is on Rikers to go back and forth to court. But what people don't know, to take detainees back and forth to court, it costs the city $42 million per year to take all detainees back to court. So the pretrial system that we had now, we have to change it. So advocates and it's Just Leadership started the Free New York campaign, and we started doing something that a lot of individuals either didn't want to do or didn't think to do, coalition building with people in upstate New York and talking to them about we are dealing with the same thing. We are dealing with a system that they're the tail of bail system that if you're rich, you'll leave free, but if you're poor, you will be in the system as long as possible until you pay your freedom or until you are copped out to something, or if you go to trial. So when we was going up to Albany for the past 3 years, we had 3 things on our table: to pass speedy trial, to get people to make sure that they're a timely frame of how long they have to be trial ready, bail reform. There's a certain part of why is someone has to pay for they're innocent when in the law it says you're innocent to proven guilty. And the most important thing, discovery law. What do you have against me? You know, in Westchester, I know they have like a 90%, knowing that 90% of people who are in their facility are gonna take a plea. That is scary when you don't know what someone has against you, and even if you're innocent, you are in fear about how the DAs play the system or the media. So 3 things that happened when we was going up to Albany for the past 3 years and 3.5 years, speaking in Senate and Assembly about the importance of passing the pre-trial, speedy trial, discovery law, and bail reform. You know, it was telling people we have to change our thinking around the criminal justice system. And you know, in April, we just recently passed remarkable 3 bills, speedy trial, discovery law, and bail reform, that will free 9,000 people from New York State jails. That's amazing. But the reason why Rikers is not closed is, one, we didn't end all cash bail. And I think that was a rule. If it would have passed, we would have ended all bail bondsmen. And I think that's the part where we also have to understand that there are places upstate who economic development is on prisons and jails. And that is hard for a lot of politicians to say, well, my neighborhood, a lot of our guys are correctional officers. What do I tell them? You know, and we had a lot of fight back from the Senate and Assembly in upstate New York about making sure this passes. And the reason, and I'm going back to why Rikers is not closed, is many different things. One, we still have people with mental health in these facilities. We also have people who are serving year sentence on Rikers Island. Majority of these people are people with misdemeanors. And I don't believe if it costs $300K per person to be in Rikers Island, why do we not put that in something more better, right? It takes, the cost to keep someone in a programs is 40 G's. So when we talk about 40 G's and 300K, as taxpayers, we got to think about, okay, how do it looks like? You know, people don't do crime because they do crime. People do crime because in reality, we live underfunded, over-incarcerated, over-policed community. And when I say crime, it's like people selling drugs because they have to put food on the table. People selling drugs because they don't know how to sit through a job interview, or they're getting turned down by jobs. And that is the hardship that a lot of people in my neighborhood are dealing with, or don't know how to write a resume. How hard is that? You know, it's hard, or people don't see other individuals being successful and stopping at the corner and having them think different. You know, that's the hard conversations that I'm having in my community. Another part is what is actually growing around the country is people who are being violated for probation and parole for simple things as failing a drug test or curfew. Can you imagine someone who got a job but can't work the evening shift because their parole says no, you can't do it? Can you imagine someone who had failed a drug test and they're dealing with whatever they're dealing with, and then being sent to Rikers and being incarcerated? That is harsh. Another part is ending the broken window policing. We learned that there's only 100 people there. people are being arrested for jumping the turnstile. I understand what it means of not having $2.75. I know how hard that is, and then for a lot of people who are here who probably have that in their pocket, someone is actually deciding of how they budget their money of rent, food, and what exactly they're going to eat. Or if I save a little bit more money on this, but I can jump the turnstile, maybe I can do this, and it's hard. A lot of people who are poor and who just don't have the lenient way to survive are doing things of a survival. So we have 100 people on Rikers Island for broken window policing. We saying end broken window policing. I'm gonna go back with mental health. We have 1,100 people who are on Rikers that we know has mental health and shouldn't be inside. We should end year sentence. It don't make sense that taxpayers are paying $300K per person and start investing and turn them to incarceration or arrest diversion. Another part about it is because of these pretrial bills as was just passed, we are estimate there's going to be 22,300 people or 2,500 people coming home because of this, right? And if we pass less is more, as we heard the earlier panelists talk about parole and probation, and in New York they have a bill called less is more. If they pass that, it'll be 300 people less on Rikers Island. So the part is that people are still going to be remanded, and it's hard to say that we haven't organized to end remanding. So Rikers is still open because there's still a lot of work to be done, not from every different angle. Before they land in there, if they are in there, what's the blueprint to make sure that they have the programs or the resources they actually need, or the people inside there to help them give them the blueprint? And the most important part, and it works on both angles, to make sure they have communities where they're coming to that's well invested in. This is not right. This is not rocket science. If we invest in the community and the basic needs that Black and brown community needs, that is the most important thing, right? So the reason why Rikers is still open, because there's still a lot of work to be done. But as New Yorkers, as people who are around the country, we should be looking at New York, but we should also understand that what can be done here, if you're from New York, can be imaged and shown around the country. And I think it's time for us as a city to step up and use our voices, but it's important for us to start coming up to Albany with us, start educating people around you, start doing the smallest thing, speaking up. That's why Rikers is still open, because we need more people on the ground. We need more people calling politicians. We need more people to come to Albany with us. We need more people to use their voices. This is the time. And this is why Rikers is still open, because we have a lot of work to be done, but we need more arms.
You heard him. There's lots to do. Bring your arms and your voice to it. Jason, can you please share your frank, informed, inside-outside perspective on the prospects for more reform in this state in the near future? Is this a time to be bold or incremental? How can New York become more of a leader on truly ending mass incarceration?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I just want to start by saying, kudos to you for, coming out on a Sunday. Everything starts with education. You can't advocate if you don't understand the system, if you don't hear from folks directly working with and in movements to make reform, to understand what is actually happening, how did we get here, what are the sort of historical elements, and how should I and can I really situate myself based on where the perspective from which I sit, the organizations that I belong to, the networks that I have. So I think everyone is doing the first step, the frontline work, which is just coming to hear from folks, talking to people, engaging in dialogue, and really becoming educated about what the problems are, what the solutions are, and what it's going to take in order for us to achieve. And the other point I want to make is when you look at the panel, and I'm so thankful to be here as a part of it, you have an organizer, a base builder, directly impacted a person with significant amount of integrity and understanding and knowledge for directly impacted communities to begin to think about how you build the people power that is absolutely necessary for any of this to be possible. You have a leader in terms of a system actor. Justine talked about public defenders being proximate. We cannot do this work. We cannot achieve transformational change without public defenders and the folks who lead public defenders, and the work of holistic representation as a way of pressing into what public defenders think about as their role in the system. And then you have, at least until up until this past Friday, a government actor, a person who had the power of the pen and had the power to negotiate and ultimately take that work as manifest through the many drafts of bills. Try to get it through what can be a nearly impossible, a Herculean political process. I kind of tweaked my own bio a bit, and I was like trying to think like I'm really like a nomad at this point. And so in characterizing, the work that I do, the word Albany Insider came up, and I was like, but I do want to say that it takes all of these actors acting with integrity towards a very particular purpose. We all believe, I think, and are aligned in what ultimately this thing needs to look like in order for our people to actually be free and for there to be equity and for us to be able to use the term justice when we describe the system of accountability and safety and restoration that we need to grow. But it takes our perspectives and positioning, and it takes dialogue and trust between these actors in order for that to happen. So what are the prospects for reform in Albany? I think that unless these kind of conversations continue to happen at all levels, and unless you as folks who need to place pressure on elected officials about what their leadership needs to look like in the space, contemplates this kind of interaction and dialogue among system actors that sometimes have to utilize different strategies in order to move the ball forward, then the prospects are grim. I think that criminal justice reform legislation and policy is some of the most difficult work to happen in Albany, and you can see sort of things like indigent legal defense and the idea that 50 or more years after the Supreme Court case that guaranteed criminal defendants the right to counsel just being realized or starting to be realized, and the effort that it took 50 years after the Supreme Court make that the supreme law of the land for us to even begin to talk about what that actually looks like in practice. When you look about raising the age of criminal responsibility, where you have 16 and 17-year-olds, and in my opinion, 18, 19, and 20 and 21-year-olds, we know the brain science behind it. All of the actors seem to be in place. We had the moral argument, we had the historical argument, and we even had the Republicans with the fiscal argument. And we just didn't seem, it took 4 years in order for that to happen. And why is it so difficult? And I think in part because, and I think this is going to only increase, is we do operate so much off fear and not by facts. When I heard Vidal kind of talking to you in concrete numbers about, what that reform effort on the pretrial will mean for decreasing the population in Rikers, and what's going to be left over and what it's going to take for us to actually then address that population. I think, decarceration, ending mass incarceration, I think that terminology has become something that folks have become more accustomed to hearing, more acclimated. But what does it actually mean? And what does it mean for our own, that piece of ourselves that might still hold on to some of those things that the culture around us has written onto the way that we think about individuals, the way that we think about communities, and the way that we think about people who have been accused of, and some who have even been convicted and committed certain crimes. And so I think all of that is the context that we are operating in. From the political side, we're going into an election year. And if you sort of look at the ebb and flows in Albany, one might argue that folks aren't going to be incentivized to swing the bat too hard this session. A lot of reform happened in this area. I think a lot of reform happened generally. Many things that we waited for years and years and years as progressives, as Democrats, to happen, happened. And so what's the skin in the game for folks, and what are we going to do to say we can't rest on our laurels, but we're going to have to press into all the things that are necessary to continue this forward trajectory? I think they sit in a couple of different buckets, and I think the first one is those offenses for which we left cash bail and pretrial detention. I think that's a front end problem, and I think it's a back end problem, right? It is the notion that we are uncomfortable right now talking about violent felony offenses. We're uncomfortable talking about people charged and convicted of violent felony offenses, both in terms of what is the measure of accountability that is appropriate on the front end, and when we talk about people who have committed those crimes and served terms of incarceration, what does it mean for somebody to come out of the system and not be layered with all of our insecurities that are manifest in things like unnecessarily long parole terms, unnecessary supervision conditions, and so on and so forth, that come from, again, the conversation and dialogue we haven't had and aren't comfortable having about violent felony offenses. I also worry about misdemeanors. Great that we ended cash bail and detention, the possibility of pretrial detention for virtually all misdemeanors and a lot of the nonviolent felony offenses. But I do worry about misdemeanors because, when you go to courthouses and you think about the churn, the low level drug offenses, the so-called quality of life offenses. I mean, that, jumping a turnstile in 2019 in New York City is even a crime at all that gets you any kind of system engagement or involvement, is a question we need to ask about ourselves. Are these really things that have an impact on public safety, or are they really just a system that we believe that we need to have to maintain order that actually is destroying people's lives and communities? And so I worry that as we move out of a situation where we see bail and those kinds of things attached to those offenses, are we going to move into a situation where we ask ourselves, should those things be criminal offenses at all, and what does that change look like? And the last piece I don't want to make sure we forget about is, while the total number of folks who are incarcerated pre-trial, certainly the total number of folks serving state prison terms is on a downward trajectory, the total number of folks in this state either under federal immigration custody who haven't committed any crimes, who are only charged with civil offenses, who are not guaranteed counsel at appearance, and who many have been living here in our communities. The destabilization that has on impact on communities, on our economy, on our democracy, and what are we really thinking about as we begin to think about those New Yorkers who are now, if not in detention, in immigration detention, who are self-selecting out of life activities like taking their kids to school and going to the doctor because of the threat and fear that just simply existing as someone with certain kinds of immigration status, or connected to folks with certain immigration statuses, that they can't be full participants in our communities and our democracy. And if we don't pay attention to that, I think it's going to become a crisis that we could have averted with some of the same energy that we've built around some of the other movements. So that's, I think, a bit of landscaping, and I'd love to, sort of hear folks thinking about that, and certainly talk to the panelists about what ending mass incarceration in New York really looks like from our variety of perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. So because we only have 10 minutes left, I'm going to open it up, and I've already got a question, so I won't even do moderator's privilege and do a first question.
It's on the last second.
Yeah.
I'm a member of CBST, and we merged with New Sanctuary Coalition and started a bail fund. A year ago, it was like $500 to support immigrants in dealing with detention. It was $500 for bail. On Friday, I heard a person $16,000.
So what we thought was going to be a revolving bail fund to help people, and then the person, when they appear in court, will get the money back, will help someone else. So we've now at CBSD, we have an asylum law clinic once a week. The situation, again, it's not the same as mass incarceration, but it is a mass incarceration, but it's from the federal level, and it's with the immigration laws, and it's like, right now, it's like terrible.
There are a lot of circumstances in which we're separating families and not thinking properly about families and
Three quick things to respond to that. One is there are state policy solutions, even though people are in federal custody. We need to fund universal representation for all immigrants in immigration court. That's something that we can do. We need to make sure that we codify executive orders that exist right now that prohibit contact between local governments and that would extend to prohibit local governments from engaging in or cooperating with federal immigration enforcement. And we certainly, I think, need to conceptualize a holistic model. We need to build on the Liberty Defense Project's sort of model of providing services, affirmative immigration services, so folks can actually become citizens, so folks can become permanent residents. So there are state solutions to those problems, and I think a lot of what, again, the political energy that's been built around bail reform, pretrial detention reform, what I think is going to come for sentencing reform and the like, it would be great to see those movements really connect and sort of supercharge those efforts.
Great, I saw a question way back there, and then you're next.
I will just yell, because I can do that.
We can hear you.
All right, so my name is Russ Agdrin. I'm the senior organizer for RAC New York. We're building a movement of 100 plus reform congregations around the state. We actually worked on a little bit of a state solution to a federal problem, getting involved in helping get driver's licenses for all passed this last session. A lot of great work by a lot of folks. I guess I have a question that's sort of a question for the two of you, and then for you, Jason. So, given the reality of 2020 not just being any election year, but also being the last election before redistricting, what do the two of you see as the priority that you really want to go to Albany for, that is at the top of your list? And Jason, what do you see as the argument we can make, given people's reticence to not necessarily swing for the fences in an election year? And what are you thinking is the argument or the campaign that's going to make the most sense? I want to hear from these guys first, and then from you. Go for it. Thank you.
One, the whole ending solitary confinement. We as advocates been fighting hard for that. Two, less is more to reform the parole and probation system. Three, I'm gonna always say that Drug Policy Alliance is trying to legalize marijuana, and I think we need to start thinking more about that. And a lot of people's like, yo, why are you fighting for that? Because my hood, my neighborhood, my community said I need to be up here and telling y'all what to do, and they're like, yo, tell them we need to legalize marijuana. So I'm like, yo, all right, well, I'm just a voice. I'm just a tunnel for my neighborhood. Those are three major things right now. We're going back to Albany to make sure we end cash bail forever. And that's four things that people can work on right now is to support the whole act, making sure the less is more, you're behind that to reform the parole and probation system. The third part, Drug Policy Alliance, to legalize marijuana. And the fourth one is to keep organizing with us because we're going back to Albany to end cash bail and changing the minds of people. I know there's a lot of organizations who are doing clemency. I think that's something too that's going to pick up this year in Albany. Yeah, I can stop there. Oh, wait, one more thing. If this is also too, what you also can do, not just in Albany, right now to September, October, you have a paper probably in front of you, I don't know where is it at, to make sure you call your city council and say you support just leadership in the Close Rikers Island campaign, led by directly impacted people that improves conditions to make sure that the city go to 12 to 4 jails. So call your city council. We have the paper right in front of you. Call them. This is a moment where you say you can be a part of something, and that's what you can be a part of. making a call, having dinner with whoever you have to have dinner with, and changing their mind. That's really it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what Vidal said. There's just one other bill that's pending. There's a Driven by Justice campaign, which extends the driver's license issue, which is, Bronx defenders alone, we only represent 48% of the people in one borough. We represent upwards of 2,000 people a year who are forced through the criminal legal system just for unpaid DMV fines and fees. So that's like a gateway into the criminal legal system. We're not talking drunk driving. We're not talking about anything else, just literally driving on a suspended license for failure to pay. So there's a campaign to end the ability of DMV to be able to suspend people's driver's license and funnel them into the criminal legal system. That campaign is called Driven by Justice. And then this is not a particular piece of legislation that's pending, but I could not agree more with Jason that we have got to start tackling our discomfort around this idea of violence. What does it really mean? What really does make us safe? What sort of underlies that sort of instinctual reaction to use the criminal legal system as a way of addressing what is really a very small fraction of the types of cases that come through.
So selfishly, I would love to see the legislature and the executive find an agreement on legalizing marijuana. In large part because I wrote the bill. I'm not going to do the Bernie, I wrote the damn bill, but I did. And so, but realistically, I do think that marijuana still plays sort of an outsized role along the spectrum. And we're talking about sort of with respect to police contact, with respect to, folks still getting prosecuted, even though we have decriminalization, the notion that that folks can still have some kind of penalty for things that other people are making millions and arguably billions of dollars off of should not sit well with us. But I think all the other aspects, the fact that people are having their kids taken away, they're being violated for parole. It's just in so many different places that I think a really structured, thoughtful, intentional legalization framework, which there exists one, I know, could really have some real impact, both in terms of the criminal legal system and collateral consequences, but also for economic opportunity and bringing some social equity and community revitalization to start to address some of those harms. I think everything Vidal said, just in terms of the policy agenda, certainly. I also just want to sort of wrap up this question by saying a lot of the conversation this year is going to be about the budget. We made significant reforms in so many areas. And so the question becomes, how do we pay for it? And how do we devote the resources that are required? We spend a lot of money, about $180 billion a year, funding state and local governments. We, in order to actually realize the objectives of this policy, in order for it to have real impact on people's lives, in order for folks like Justine and Vidal to be able to do the things that are necessary in order to effectuate the purposes of these bills, they're going to have to be appropriately funded. These efforts are going to have to be appropriately funded. So let's not think that budget is just sort of balancing the checkbook. It is, but there is so much policy, so much operations, and that fight is really, really, really important as we build upon what has happened last year, and certainly as we begin to articulate what the new objectives are for the upcoming session.
Thank you so much. And I hate to do this, but I am asked to... Your question got answered. Phenomenal.
I'll talk to you all
Great.
day afterwards about that.
So I'm going to exhort everybody to run and grab your lunch and bring it back in quickly. Is that the best way to do it, Melanie? And
come early and needs to speak to us early.
great. So anyway, I'll see you all on the bus with Vidal after this. Okay?
Yes.